The Taxman Cometh, How America's Most Feared Gangster Met His Downfall *, a DeepSoul Radio original. They called him Scarface, public enemy number one. The king of Chicago's underworld. But in the end, it wasn't a hail of bullets that brought down the most notorious gangster in American history. It was a piece of paper. A tax form. "I don't even know what street Canada is on," Al Capone once joked. But there was one thing he couldn't laugh his way out of: the unforgiving reach of the Internal Revenue Service. The year was 1931. America was gripped by the Great Depression. Prohibition was the law of the land. And in the shadowy streets of Chicago, one man's criminal empire seemed untouchable. How could a figure responsible for over 200 deaths, who controlled a bootlegging operation worth millions, who struck fear into the hearts of both criminals and civilians alike, how could such a man ever be brought to justice? The answer would shock a nation. Brooklyn, New York, January 17, 1899. Alphonse Capone entered the world as one of 9 children born to Italian immigrant parents. Nothing about his birth suggested the terror he would one day inspire, or the spectacular way his reign would end. By his early teens, young Alphonse had already abandoned formal education, drawn instead to the allure of street gangs. What began as petty theft and vandalism would evolve into something far more sinister when the young man with ambitious eyes moved to Chicago, a city about to enter a perfect storm of crime. The scar that gave him his famous nickname came from an early miscalculation. A lewd remark about another gangster's sister earned him a slash across his left cheek that would become his gruesome calling card. But it wasn't just his face that was marked by violence, it was his very soul. When Prohibition swept across America in 1920, it created a vacuum that men like Capone were all too eager to fill. While law-abiding citizens mourned their lost right to drink, the criminal underworld glimpsed an opportunity dripping with profit. By the mid-1920s, an estimated 1,300 gangs prowled Chicago's streets, but none were more feared than Capone's outfit. At just 26 years old, when most men were settling into careers or starting families, Alphonse Capone was handed the keys to a criminal empire that would soon make Chicago the throne of gang activity in America. Bootlegging, brothels, gambling, extortion, Capone's tentacles stretched into every dark corner of the city. The New Yorker magazine crowned him the greatest gang leader in history in 1928. By the following year, his fortune was estimated in the multi-millions, a staggering sum in an era when the average American earned less than $2,000 annually. But even as Capone basked in wealth and notoriety, the seeds of his downfall were taking root. The citizens of Chicago had grown weary of the bloodshed. The bodies were piling up. And one particular event would forever stain the city's history. February 14th, 1929. Valentine's Day. Not a day for romance in Chicago, but for massacre. 7 men of the Bugs Moran gang, bitter rivals of Capone, were lined up against a wall in a North Side garage and executed in cold blood. Some of the killers wore police uniforms, a cruel deception that allowed them to herd their victims like cattle to slaughter. Though Capone was conveniently in Florida when the triggers were pulled, few doubted who had orchestrated the bloodbath. The St. Valentine's Day massacre shocked even a city numbed by violence, and it caught the attention of a newly inaugurated President Herbert Hoover. Pressured by Chicago businessmen desperate to end the reign of terror, Hoover made a presidential decree: Al Capone must be stopped. But how do you catch a shadow? A man who left no paper trail, owned little property in his name, kept no bank accounts? A man who had corrupted police, judges, and politicians? The answer came from an unexpected quarter: the Bureau of Internal Revenue, what we now know as the IRS. For 2 years, government accountants tracked Capone's expenses with painstaking thoroughness. They couldn't find his income, but they could follow his spending: the $30 shirts, the $100 suits, the $12,000 cars. A simple question emerged: if Capone had no income, how could he afford such luxury? Where there's smoke, there's fire, and Capone's lifestyle was a roaring inferno. On June 5, 1931, Al Capone was charged with 22 counts of income tax evasion. The government alleged he owed more than $215,000 in back taxes, derived from an estimated $1 million in income between 1924 and 1929. And that was just what they could prove. Desperate, Capone reportedly offered the government $1 million to end the prosecution. They not only declined, they used his offer as evidence that he indeed had income during those years. The trial that followed featured a jury of simple, rural men who gasped at testimony describing Capone's extravagant lifestyle. Even details of his luxurious silk underwear drew laughter from the courtroom and a humiliated scowl from Capone. On October 17, 1931, the verdict came down, guilty on 5 counts of tax evasion. 1 week later, the sentence, 11 years in federal prison, plus fines and back taxes totaling nearly $300,000. The man who had terrorized Chicago, who had ordered countless executions, who had built an empire on blood and illegal alcohol, was brought down not by a rival's bullet, but by a tax form. After failed appeals, Capone found himself in Atlanta's federal penitentiary, later transferred to the infamous island fortress of Alcatraz. By 1938, his health was deteriorating rapidly from untreated syphilis, the dementia it caused slowly erasing the brilliant criminal mind that had once ruled Chicago. Released in 1939 for good behavior, Capone was a shell of his former self. He retreated to his Florida estate, his mental capacity significantly diminished, where he lived out his remaining years in the custody of his own failing body. On January 25, 1947, just days after his 48th birthday, Alphonse Capone's heart gave out. The man, who had once been America's most feared criminal, died not in a blaze of gunfire but in the quiet ignominy of disease. The extraordinary life of America's most notorious gangster ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. Yet his legacy, and the lesson of his downfall, echoes through American history. No matter how powerful, how feared, how wealthy you become, no one escapes the taxman. What do you believe happened here? Share your theory in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to DeepSoul Radio for more chilling cases like this.